Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to Testaholics meeting, managing a complicated testing project. We will do a quick introduction about ourselves, our sponsors, our guest speaker, and we'll get going with today's presentation. We are called Testaholics Anonymous. We are a meetup group. We've started in 2016, focusing on quality for Chicago area. And in 2019, under new leadership, we became international. Since then, we hosted many meetings in the form of tech talks, fireside chats, monthly presentations, and workshops. We focus on what community is asking. And we do some follow-ups and feedbacks, and we do the events accordingly. Currently, we are nearing 800 members on the meetup group. So we have many ways for you to connect with us. We have meetup group, LinkedIn page, Slack, YouTube, and GitHub. Kindly support us and join these groups to get the latest updates, or ring the bell icon on YouTube. Our sponsor is Slalom, specialized in delivering custom-built solutions as service. We help companies accelerate their digital transformation journey. Please find more on slalom.com. So we have our co-host here, Sven. Do you like to introduce yourself quickly?
Hi, everyone. My name is Sven Therian. I'm a principal over at Slalom here in the Chicago office, and I've been organizer of Testaholics Anonymous since 2019.
Thanks, Ben. Kristin, I want to quickly introduce you, and then I'll let you introduce yourself as well. So today, our guest speaker is Kristin Jackvony, and she wrote a couple of books, The Complete Software Tester and Logical Fallacies for Testers. She also has created a lot of content and is a blogger on thinktester.com. And I follow you, Kristin, very diligently on LinkedIn. And when I was scouting for speakers, I reached out to you. Thank you so much for sharing your experience with us. We can go ahead and share your screen. I think we made you the host.
Okay. Please current share. All right. Can you see my screen, my PowerPoint?
Not yet.
Not yet? Okay, let me try now. How about now?
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. All right. Wonderful. All right. So hello, everybody. Thank you so much for being here. I am excited to talk to you about this topic. Let's see if I can change my slide here. There we go. A little bit about me before we get started. So as mentioned, I'm the author of 2 books, The Complete Software Tester and Logical Fallacies for Testers. I'm the creator of 2 courses, Monday Morning Automation on YouTube and Postman Essential Training on LinkedIn Learning. I'm a blogger at Think Like a Tester, and my day job, I am a principal engineer for software testing. So here's our agenda for today. These are the steps that we're going to go through for figuring out how to manage the testing of a complicated software project. So first step is to understand the problem, figure out exactly why is this project going to be complicated to test. Then you need to consider staffing, who's going to do the testing. Then tooling, what kinds of tooling do you need to accomplish your testing? And then what plans and procedures do you need to get your testing done? Then we'll talk about cooperation with dependent teams. And when we get there, I will explain what a dependent team is. And then finally, we will talk about the rollout strategy. How do you roll out this big change that you've just tested? So let's dive right in. So part 1, understanding the problem. So you have figured out that there is going to be some software project that is going to be complicated. And so the first step is to figure out what exactly is complicated about it. So describe the problem. Think about what the problem is. So here's a list of some things that could make a software testing project complicated. So your application might be undergoing a complete UI refresh, which means there's going to be all kinds of buttons and navigation and text fields that could be very different from what they were before. So that can be very complicated. Or it could be that you are changing business logic. Maybe your application has some very complicated business logic and something has happened that has required you to change the rules. And so now you're going to have to figure out all of the different ramifications of those rule changes. Or it could be that you have a bunch of APIs that you are updating, and you need to make sure that when you do that, you're not breaking things. Or it could be that you're changing data stores. Perhaps you are changing from a regular Microsoft SQL database to a NoSQL database like MongoDB, and that could have some very serious implications. Or you might be switching cloud providers. You might decide that instead of having Azure be the cloud provider for your application, that you want to use AWS instead. Those are going to be some huge changes where you're going to need to test everything. And then finally, you might be swapping out third-party applications. Perhaps your application requires a number of third-party apps, and some of those apps aren't working for you anymore or just aren't meeting your needs. So you might want to swap them out for something else. So that will require a lot of testing. And so in addition to describing the problem, you also want to think about what the risks are. What are the risks of this big software testing project? So one big risk could be time constraints. You might find that you have to do a lot of testing in a very short amount of time to meet the deadline. Or a constraint could be knowledge of the product. Maybe you are updating one legacy part of your application that only one or two people know about because everybody else has left the company. And so there's a lot of mystery there. Or it could be just that complicated business logic that maybe only a few people know, or maybe a bunch of people know it, but it's still extremely complicated. So you're going to have to think about all the different permutations. There could be staffing issues, and we will talk about that in the next section. You might not have as many testers as you need. You might be the only tester on the project. And so you'll want to think about if you can get some more people to help you. And then finally, there's also the risk about cooperation between teams. If you're going to need to have a lot of dependent teams doing testing, which we'll talk about a little later, there's a risk there because what if they don't help? So now we come to part 2, where we think about staffing the project. How are you going to staff the project? So here are some considerations as you are assembling your software test team. What might the optimal dev to test ratio be for this project? And it could really vary. If it's a project that is mostly back end and you already have a lot of API automation set up, it could be that really just running a lot of regression tests in your API automation might be all you need for this complicated project, in which case maybe it could just be you and one or two other people who are working on the testing. But the project could also require a great deal of hands-on manual testing. For example, if you are completely redoing a mobile application, you would require a lot of testers who could have their eyeballs on those mobile devices to test things. So in that case, the dev test ratio would be smaller. So think about that, and then think about how many testers do you have? And how many testers are you missing to get to that ideal ratio that you want? Do you have the resources to hire more testers? You might need to make a presentation to your management saying, here are the reasons why this project is going to be risky, and here's what I think the optimal dev to test ratio will be due to the amount of work we're going to need to do. So this is why I think we should hire 2 more testers, for example. And then if you do get the resources to hire more testers, you can also think about, are those testers going to be permanent or are they going to be temporary? If this is a project that's sort of a a one-off project, and once it's over, you're not going to need those testers anymore, you might want to consider hiring contractors who will just be there for the length of the project. But if you know that your company is going to continue to grow and that you are going to have complicated test projects again, you might want to hire permanent testers instead. Another thing to consider is whether you could borrow testers from another team for the project. So it could be that there are some testers on other teams who maybe are having a slow point in their fiscal year, and you might be able to borrow them for the extent of the project. Although I will say that one thing that I found that does not work well is don't try to borrow a tester for just 1 or 2 days a week. What I found when I tried that out was that that tester is always going to be focused on their own product. So either get them to come over to your team 100% of the time, or try to hire from outside the company so that you can have some new people who can focus solely on your project. And then once you've got your test team, think about organizing the test team. There are a lot of different things that you will need your testers to do, and it's a good idea to have at least one tester be the expert on each of those things. So here are some of the things that you might consider depending on what your project is. So there's keeping the lights on. So for example, if you've got an application that is being completely updated, but right now your end users are using the old application, you're going to want to make sure that that old application is still working because that is where all of your users are. So definitely need to have somebody focused on that. Then also there's front-end testing. If you are making lots of UI changes, you'll want to have somebody focused on testing those. There's back-end testing like API testing or data store testing. So someone needs to focus on that. Then if you have a mobile component to your application, or if your application is entirely mobile, you will definitely need mobile testing. Then there's cloud provider testing. So for example, if your application or your feature has like messaging queues, like notifications, things like that, you'll want to make sure that you're testing those. Then you want to think about automation. There's going to be front-end automation and API automation and perhaps mobile automation. So you're going to need to have somebody focused on keeping those tests up and running. So that's a lot of things, and that might actually be more things than you have testers. So consider which tester is going to be the primary person for each of these areas, but then also make sure that there is at least one backup for each area too. For example, you do not want to have one person be the expert in all things mobile testing, because then if she goes on vacation, nobody is going to know what to do. Or if she quits the company, nobody's going to know what to do. So make sure that you always have a backup when you're organizing your test team. So now that you have organized your team, now it's time to think about tooling. Now you might already have some test tools available because you've probably already been testing this product or feature. But if it's a new feature that's using new technology, that might require new tooling. So here are a couple of important things that I think you should consider when you're thinking about your tooling. The first one is choosing a test case management system. So for many projects, it's pretty easy to just use wiki pages or spreadsheets and say, this is our regression test plan. We can just run through it. But when you're doing a complicated testing project, that can get too labor intensive. If you find that you have to do your regression testing a lot, and so you're having to copy over that wiki page to make the new test plan for the new regression, and then you've got to delete all of the check marks you have there, and then you've got to assign it to somebody, that can get very labor intensive. So it's a good idea to use a test case management system. But you will want to choose a system that allows you to create test cases and test runs very quickly. You don't want a system that makes you have to like spend more time working on the system than actually doing testing. And you also want to choose a system that allows you to integrate with your test automation so that in that system you can see how are your manual regression test cases going and how are your automated regression cases going. And then you'll want to keep the test cases lightweight. So don't feel like in your test cases you need to put in a whole bunch of different setup steps like logging in, navigating to this page. Assume that the testers that you are working with already understand that. So keep the cases lightweight, like log in as an admin user and validate that you go to the admin page. Just something simple like that. Another thing you might want to consider is to choose a testing platform, like for example, with a device farm. So if your project has mobile components, you might want to consider signing up for a device farm such as BrowserStack or Sauce Labs, because device farms in the cloud are maintained by the people in the cloud that you are paying to maintain them. If you decide, oh, we're going to maintain all of our own devices, that means you have to choose what all of the devices are. You have to make sure that you've got the budget to purchase the devices. You have to set up all of the devices. You have to make sure all the devices are charged. You have to make sure that the application is loaded on all of the devices. And then if the device has a problem, you have to fix the device. Whereas if it's a device farm in the cloud, the people that you're paying take care of all of that for you. You might also want to consider a cloud testing platform if you need to support browsers that you can't test on your own computer. For example, if you need to support Safari and your whole testing team is using Windows computers, you might want to use that cloud testing platform so that they can go to Safari through the platform and test the application there. And then also consider that your testing platform should integrate with your automated test tool and your build system. So for example, if you're doing mobile testing and you're using that device farm, you want to make sure that your build system can build the mobile app and then upload it to your device farm in the cloud so that you can run your tests there very easily. Okay, let's go on to part 4, plans and procedures. So you've got your tooling, you've got your team, you understand what your risks are. Now's the time to figure out your plans. So the first place that I like to start is creating manual smoke tests. Already have these smoke tests available if this is a product or a feature that you've been testing for a while. But consider this with your smoke tests. What is the absolute bare minimum that your updated application or feature should be able to do? And I like to call this a level 0 smoke test. So that's just like, for example, if you had a mobile application, can you log into the application and does it load the home page? That would be very, very basic. That's some level 0 stuff. And then think about what's the minimum that each feature in your application should be able to do. So for example, if your application was like let's pretend it was like the Amazon mobile app, you would want to be able to log into the application, go to the home page, do a search, put something in your cart, and then purchase that item. So those would be level 1 smoke test kinds of activities. And then you also want to create manual feature regression tests. So think about each of the different features that you have in your application that you will need to be regression testing, and then create a smoke test for each feature. So for example, if we're using that Amazon app example, one feature would be the search feature. On the Amazon app, you want to be able to search for a whole bunch of different things. So a smoke test for each feature might include searching on one keyword, filtering the results by most popular, things like that. And then you'll also want to create a full regression suite for each feature. So for the search feature, the full regression suite would be much longer. You would talk about searching for a very long search title or several words as opposed to one word, or filtering in a bunch of different ways, or combining filters, things like that. So the reason why you want to have these feature regression tests is so that every time somebody says to you, like a developer says to you, oh, well, we've made a bunch of changes, but I'm really concerned about the search feature because I touched that a little bit, so I think you ought to do a full regression there. You've got that test plan all ready to go. Then you'll also want to create end-to-end manual regression tests. So it's not enough just to test all of the independent components of your application. You'll want to do some of the typical user journeys to make sure that a user can really get from point A to point B. So in our Amazon example, that would be logging in and doing a search and maybe filtering the search and maybe putting an item in the cart, maybe taking an item out of the cart and then checking out. And then you'll also want to think about your common feature interaction gotchas. If this is an application that you're already familiar with, you probably know where the gotchas are. You know which features don't work very well together or which bug keeps on cropping up over and over again. So you're going to want to make sure that you've included the regression tests for those gotchas. Next, you're going to want to create test users. Test users are extremely important, and it is extremely important to have a page or some kind of repository of test users that you can share with everybody. And here is why. Especially with developers, you can imagine if a developer is developing a feature and they have to make it work for both an admin user and a regular user, and they've coded the feature and they've coded that in, the admin user behaves this way, the regular user behaves this way. If they don't have an admin user to test with, they might just test with the regular user and leave it up to you to test with the admin user. And so then you might find bugs because they didn't actually do that testing. But if they've got lots of different test users around to choose from, they will be more likely to do that kind of testing before they hand off the stories for you to test. And that just saves everybody time. It's also really useful for the people on your team, the other testers, especially new testers who might not have a repository of test users to use. If you've got something all set up for everybody, it makes it easy for everybody. So think about these kinds of test users. Users with various login scenarios. For example, what if their password expired? What if they don't have challenge questions set? Think about users who haven't yet registered if you do have a registration system for your users. Think about users with different permission levels, like we talked about with like an admin user or a regular user. Think about users who don't have a feature enabled. If your application has like a pro feature and a free feature, you want to make sure that your free users aren't accessing that pro feature. And then you'll want to have users in every single environment from QA to prod. I'm always surprised when I encounter teams that don't have prod users ready. What if something goes wrong in the application in prod and you need to reproduce the issue? If you don't have users handy, it's going to greatly increase the time it's going to take to resolve the problem. So make sure you've got users in every environment. And then keep your users in the wiki pages, and as I mentioned, share them with anyone who needs them. Next, create a knowledge base wiki. So include instructions for how to configure various features, because you might have some new testers who either are new to the company or are new to the project. They might not know how to set up some of your more complicated features. So make sure you're including those instructions. Include instructions on how to validate important integrations like database validations or push and email notifications. So for example, if you needed to test that an event in your application triggered an email and the email was going to go to some test address, make sure people know how to get to the test address so they can check that the email went out. Make sure to keep the wiki well organized and alphabetized. I know that seems like a lot of work, but it's definitely worth it because every time someone gets the answer to a question without going to you, you've saved yourself some time that you can be using for creating test plans or doing testing yourself. Also make sure to name each entry with the word that most clearly describes the task. So if you are thinking about instructions about how to set up email notifications, you don't want to call that entry setting up email notifications, because then that's going to be under S. Nobody's going to look for the email setup under S. You want to name it email notification setup so that they can look under E for email and they can find the instructions that they need. Also, create process documents. You've probably worked with lots of different testers, and you've probably noticed that different testers have different ways of organizing their test plans, or different ways of executing them, or a level of completeness of how they execute them, how they log a bug, what kinds of details they include, or what they test in a bug fix. So make sure that you are creating process documents that the whole team can use and agree upon, for things like writing those test plans. When you execute the test plans, are you going to execute them on all browsers, or is only one browser okay? Which test environment are you going to test with? Is it important to test in more than one environment? How to log a bug. What kinds of details do you want to put in that bug so that the developers can fix it quickly? And then how to validate a bug fix. Sometimes testers, when they see a bug that's been fixed, they go through just the repro steps and they say, oh, well, it's fixed now. And they don't think about the possible regressions that could have happened during that bug fix. Also, you will want to create test automation. So think about creating API automation. And for API automation, consider automating in code rather than through Postman or Bruno. I'm a big fan of Postman. I really like using Postman for testing, but I don't like it to use it for automation quite so much, because the automation winds up being a gigantic JSON file with all of the tests in it, as opposed to automating in Selenium or Cypress or Playwright, where you can see in code all of the different individual tests. They're easy to get to, they're easy to maintain. For UI automation, make sure you're keeping your tests as small and atomic as possible. You might want to have little tests that are checking the presence of a button, or checking the presence of an error message if a user does something wrong. And then think about your end-to-end UI automation and keep it to a minimum. Only automate the most common user journeys, because as you all know, the UI automation is the flakiest, it's the most likely to cause problems, it's also the slowest. You do not want to spend all of your time in your complicated testing project fixing your UI automation, so keep it to a minimum. Then if your application has native mobile code, consider enlisting the help of your mobile developers to create the test framework. And here's why. Mobile automation is still a really, really tricky thing. There is Appium. You can write automation for mobile through Appium, but that also involves being able to identify all of the elements in the application. That can be very difficult. If you have your developers helping you, they could create a test framework in the language that's actually using the application. So for example, if they're coding the iOS mobile app using Xcode tools, then you can use Xcode test, XCUI test for your testing. Or if the application is being coded on Android using Kotlin, you could set up espresso tests. And the mobile developers already know how all of these things work, how they're organized, how they're set up. And so if they set up the framework for you and teach you how to use it, that saves a lot of time, because then you can just use your time to add new tests to the framework they already made, or maintain the existing ones. If you have a progressive web application, meaning that you can use a mobile phone, mobile device to use the app, but it's really on the mobile browser, you can emulate mobile browser testing. So if you've got Cypress or Playwright tests or Selenium tests, you can say, hey, I just want to emulate that this is an Android tablet, and run your tests that way. You'll also want to stay in touch with your test team. This is really easy if you work in a co-located space, like an office. I work remotely, so when I stay in touch with the people I work with, I'm always using a chat channel or a Teams conversation. So you'll want to have a chat channel just for the testers so that you can talk about all of the issues you've discovered. You can help each other. You'll want to have chat channels for communicating with the developers for when you have questions, and product managers if you're saying, I'm not sure that this screen looks the way the product manager really wants it to, I better check with them. Then you'll also want to have a monthly testers meeting where you can get together and talk about any issues that you might have, any concerns. If your project has a very short time window, you might even want to make that meeting bi-monthly or weekly or maybe even daily, depending on the level of work that needs to be done and how quickly it needs to be done. And then make sure to have a meeting with a screen share whenever anyone has a complicated question. Sometimes it's just so easy to both be looking at the same thing and then they can point and they can say, no, it's this button that I think is the problem. And oh, okay. And then there's no misunderstandings. So now we come to part 5, which is cooperation with dependent teams. So let's define what a dependent team is. So a dependent team could be a team that uses your feature. For example, if you had a video feature that you were responsible for and a whole bunch of other teams in your company use that video feature, those teams would be dependent teams. Or maybe you have a bunch of teams that use an API that your team owns, and you are about to make a whole bunch of changes to the API. So you need to make sure that all the teams that use your API are not negatively impacted. Those are dependent teams. Additionally, if you've got UI changes on a screen that maybe a whole bunch of teams use, then those teams would be dependent teams. Or if you're making a change to a data store, if other teams are going to call that same data store and you've suddenly changed it, so now it's a NoSQL database instead of a SQL database, there might be a lot of teams who would be dependent on that and impacted by the change. And then finally, if you're making changes to the cloud, any teams that are using your application or your feature or your messaging service, they're going to be impacted because they need to make sure that their application is logging in correctly and hits the right cloud provider and all of that. So if you know you have a bunch of dependent teams that you are going to need to help with testing the complicated testing project, first thing to do is to create a wiki describing the changes that are going to be made. So create a wiki page that highlights the differences in behavior that the testers are going to see. You also might want to mention like the time frame, like this change is going to roll out in July, something like that. Provide any technical documentation that the teams are going to need for testing. So you might say, for example, if there's a new database, you might say, as of July 1st, teams will need to have their software use these credentials to get to the new database instead of the old credentials. Those are just some examples. You'll want to ask your dependent teams to create some test plans. So when you ask them that, include instructions for the teams about things that their test plan should include. Provide a deadline for creating the test plans. So you could say to all of the teams, we need you to have your test plan created by April 1st. Don't forget when you're making your test plan to include testing the notification service that our product uses, something like that. And then review those test plans to make sure that nothing has been overlooked and make sure that you can access the test plans as well as the dependent teams so that everybody has a very clear picture of what is being tested. Then create a testing schedule. And so the timing that I have here in this testing schedule, these are all just examples, but let's say that you want to have your dependent teams doing their testing 6 months before release, because 6 months before release, you're going to have the changes in the testing environment. So that's when you want them to do their initial round of testing. So you could say to them, here's the day we're going to start the testing. We would like to have sign off from you a week later. And then you might also want to schedule a second round of testing for testing the bug fixes. So you could say, like, let's say everybody was doing their testing at the beginning of May, and you could say, okay, well, at the beginning of June, you're going to do a second round of testing to test all the bugs that you found and we fixed. For the staging environment, you might want to have people testing 3 months before release. For production, you might want to have them testing 1 month before release. Whatever it is that's most appropriate for you, just make sure you've got that schedule and that you're communicating it with the dependent teams so that they understand that they need to build that into their work. Then make sure to send out reminders before each of the testing windows. So 2 weeks before, you say, by the way, everybody, remember that we need you to test in the QA environment because of the big change that we made. And don't forget, we've got this sign-off sheet. And then remind them again 1 week before, remind them a day before. Be available for questions. You might even want to create a chat channel, like a Slack channel for your dependent teams, so that if they've got questions about the new feature, if they say, wow, nothing seems to be working like it's supposed to, what's going on, you can help them out. Follow up with teams that haven't signed off by the deadline. And if you find that there are teams who are not cooperating, then make sure to escalate with their managers or directors if needed. Make sure to underscore the importance of why the sign-off is needed so that you can get those sign-offs from all the dependent teams. And now we come to part 6, which is the rollout strategy. So at this point, you have all of your test plans, you've executed them all, you've gotten all of your dependent teams to execute their plans. And so now it's time to think about how are you going to roll out this gigantic change to the world. So the first thing to think about is upgrade and rollback testing. So you will definitely want to make sure that when you make this giant change that there's no impact to the end user. So you'll want to test that upgrade from the old app to the new app. And then you'll also want to have a rollback plan. This is very important. You don't want to roll out some giant change and then discover that nobody can log into your application anymore. So make sure that you're testing rolling back from the new application back to the old application. And then in both directions, if you have users that have authenticated with a password or some other system, make sure that your user settings are saved. You definitely do not want your users to have an experience of opening up a refreshed application and suddenly finding that they're not logged in anymore and that all of their preferences are gone. Because in a lot of times in applications, the user's login will be remembered. So the user has no idea what their login is, and they don't want to have to go look for it, and they don't want to do a password reset. So see if you can verify or see if you can save as many of those user settings as possible. And then you come to rollout part 1, which is your company. Give your whole company, not just the software teams, access to the application and say, hey, we need your help. Can you please try out our newly refreshed application and provide feedback to us? Consider holding a bug bash with snacks if you're all co-located, or maybe prizes if you're not. Try and make it super fun. And then make sure to thank your colleagues for any bugs that they found, even if they were already found, even if they were user error. Sometimes when you have colleagues from other places in the company, they might not really understand how to use your particular product or feature, but if they're trying, if they're looking for bugs, that is really helpful, and you can find some good bugs that way. And next, think about early adopters. Hopefully you've got product managers who are working with customers who want to be early adopters to your change, if that is applicable to your situation. So find some early adopters, and then each week add a few more customers. And this way, if you've got any customers who maybe have some very strange configuration for the product and the update has broken it, you can find that out with that one customer instead of finding that out with the 20 other customers that have the same setup. And then finally, you've got rollout part 3, which is general availability. This is where you are rolling it out to all of the public, all of your users. So work with your product managers to create a phased release if it's possible. So I know, for example, with mobile applications, it's possible to roll out the app a few percentage points at a time. So you could say in week 1, we're going to roll out to 1% of users, and then in week 2, we're going to roll out to 10% and gradually increase that way. Make sure when you do this that you have good monitoring and logging in place so that you will be alerted to any issues as soon as they happen. So for example, if you were rolling out your mobile app change to 1% of users, you could watch your logs, and if you suddenly see that you're getting a whole bunch of 500 errors, you can say, oh, something is wrong here, and then you can roll back or you can investigate the problem to see exactly what's going on. And then finally, make sure to bask in your success. So because you had a detailed and organized approach, you will have released a complicated project with few bugs, delighting your end users. And so make sure that you are celebrating your success with your testing team, with your developers who did all of the development work, your product managers, and everyone who contributed. Make sure that you really appreciate all of their hard work. And that is all I have. I am looking forward to taking your questions. I see we've got 2 in chat already. But before I take the questions, I just want to run through all the different ways that you can interact with me. So you can find my website with my blog at thinkingtester.com. You can also connect with me on LinkedIn and on X. I'm just at Kristin Jackvony. You can find my complete software tester book on Amazon. It's available both on Kindle and paperback. My Logical Fallacies book, Logical Fallacies for Testers, you can find that on Amazon. That's on Kindle only. It's just a tiny little book, easy read. My Monday Morning Automation course you can find on YouTube, or if for some reason you don't want to go to YouTube, I also have all of those videos on a Telegram channel. So you can message me through LinkedIn and I can get you hooked up with the Telegram channel. And then finally, there's Postman Essential Training, which is my LinkedIn Learning course. All right, I'm going to take a little water here and then I will start taking the questions.
Thank you, Kristin. It was a beautiful presentation. I mean, I really love the checklist. Many a times, I typically forget test users that you spoke about on different environments, the rollout plan, and just informing different teams to be prepared. That's very good. Yeah, thank you for this. Now, would you like me to read the question?
Oh, I can read them through. That's okay. I'm going to move my screen here a little bit. So, okay. How do you deal with systems that are all reliant under a single monolithic DB, but backend logic is separated amongst different platforms? Well, I think, yeah, so I've experienced this where like everything is in the same database. So I guess it would depend on what kind of change is being made. I mean, if you were doing something like migrating the entire database to a new system, that would be a gigantic project. I think that, excuse me, I think that it would be a good idea maybe if it was a migration to migrate like one platform at a time. You could maybe think about it in terms of like the API. So if you could have one API that used to be pointed to the old database, now pointed to the new database. And then with each move like that, you would want to make sure that you had like contract testing in place, or that every team that's using that API can still use it and can still use it in conjunction with the information that they're getting from their own API in the old database. So I guess that's just off the top of my head there. How to arrange automation tests as an only tester in a team. And there are no requirements, no test cases. Well, this is my opinion, but I feel that it is very important to always start with the manual testing. So if you've got a new product, you're the only tester on the team, nobody has ever documented any kind of test cases. Like I would start, if I were you, I would start right there with level 0 smoke tests. What is the basic thing that this application needs to be doing? And create the tests for that. And then create a slightly fuller smoke test, your level 1 smoke test, and create all the documentation for that. And then only after you've got those things and maybe your feature smoke tests, then maybe you could start working on your automation. And then, at that point, you might just want to start with automating just the simple smoke test so that you've got the test framework set up. And then at that point, you could also say to your developers, hey, I've got the test framework all set up here. This is how it works. This is how you add tests. It would be really helpful for us as a team if you could add some tests as we go along. Sometimes that's successful, sometimes it's not. It depends on the team. Thoughts on test-driven development. I am not actually a huge TDD fan. I understand the importance of testers being involved from the very beginning of a project. I think that's extremely important, because a lot of times testers think of things that developers might not think of in terms of like how one feature might work with another feature. But if a developer wants to use TDD while they're developing, like if they're creating like TDD unit tests where they're using the process by which, they're going to make the tests first, then all the tests are going to fail because they haven't coded anything yet, and then they're writing their code, and then their tests pass. I think that's fine. I have no problem with that, and if that works for developers, I think that's great. But the idea of the testers writing the automation first, I think is not such a good idea, because it's been my experience that, especially when you're creating new features or doing a refresh, a UI refresh, that things are going to change as they go along. And so you don't want to create a whole bunch of automated tests and then have to keep updating them every time the product manager says, oh, wait, we need to pivot here, we need to make a change. Okay, any other questions? These are good questions so far.
Anybody else in the room have a question?
Yeah, I have one. You mentioned test. You mentioned test firms, and it's great that we have access to those tools like BrowserStack and Sauce Labs. However, not all libraries, and as a result, not all components behave the same way on real device as on emulators. So what would be the best approach in this case? Thank you.
So I'm a big fan of BrowserStack, and on BrowserStack, those devices are actually real devices. Like if you're logging into an iPhone, that iPhone is actually like a physical iPhone that's in a data center in one of BrowserStack's data centers. That's one thing that you can consider. I believe that Sauce Labs uses more emulators and simulators than they do real devices. And I am definitely a big fan of testing on the real devices. Another thing that you can do is you can have your testers each have one physical device in their home. Like let's say, for example, if you're not co-located, like if everybody's working from home, you can mail each tester one device, or maybe two, one iOS, one Android. This is what I have done before, where sometimes you're interacting with BrowserStack, there might be, like a lag when it's reaching the data center or whatever, and you're not really sure, like to have an actual device in your hand can be very useful. So if there is a budget for that, you could do that. You could give each tester 1 or 2 devices in hand, is what I've called them before, as opposed to real devices, because the browser stack devices are real devices too. Let's see, here's another one from chat. Do you believe that automated tests should run before a build, and what tests should run after deployment? Okay, well, I mean, like, yes, automated tests should run before and after. It just depends on what kinds of tests you want to run. So definitely, before a build, you want the unit tests to run, because if there's going to be any problems, you want to find that out first, and then the build, or I wouldn't say before a build, I'd say during the build. And so then the build failed because the unit tests failed. There might be some integration tests that you could incorporate then there as well. The tests that should be run after a deployment, if you're talking about deployment to production, I would say you want to keep your automated tests to a minimum, because you don't want to get in a situation where there's like a false failure and your whole deployment rolls back. So I would say some simple smoke tests. Like if we go back to our Amazon example, let's say you want to do you probably don't want to run through like your entire user journey on your Amazon app, but you might want to just make sure that you can access the home page. Make sure that the home page has the key components on it, like the search bar is there, something like that. And then also really useful is API testing, because API tests are less flaky. So you could have like an API test where you're doing a GET request for a search, or a GET request for the cart, or something like that, and just making sure that you're getting a response from the database. So then other kinds of tests, I could go on and on about this because I love talking about it, but like you can also have like nightly automation that is running in your QA environment. So that really has nothing to do with the build or deployment, but it can pick up changes. If somebody made some changes in the test environment, and they didn't have a unit test that failed, but it broke something because maybe there was some kind of integration or whatever, those nightly tests can catch that, and then you can see it in the morning and you could say, hey, did you make a change here? And catch it there.
Any other questions from the room? Do you have a question? Yeah.
Hi, Kristin.
Hi.
Kumar. Thank you for this today. And yeah, I really liked earlier what you mentioned about the test users in different environments, different levels of permissions. One question I have for you is in the production environment, as you mentioned earlier, that you like to have test users because we do want to test in production environment and see if there's any issues there. How do you go about having test users that has admin permission in production environment? The reason I'm asking is test users usually are shared easily, and and also whoever uses test user, we may not have a track of who made the actual change. So there are some risks involved. How do you mitigate those, and how do you go about that? Thank you.
Yeah, that is a good question. And the answer to that is really going to depend on exactly how your application is set up. So for something like an admin user in production, you might want to have, like, let's say there's an account. I'm trying to figure out how to do this without getting like too specific to the company where I work, but let's say that you have a whole bunch of different customer accounts in production. You could have a customer account that isn't real at all, like the entire thing is fake. Like everybody can see that it's a fake account, and the admin user only has access to that fake account. So then in that respect, you could still share out that admin user, because there would be no way for that admin user to get access to anything else except the fake test account. So that would be one way. If that was still too risky, then it might be a good idea to have only one person have access to that admin account. And so then if there was like a problem in production, you might have to have that one person, maybe like a high up person that's got more security clearance or whatever, you might have to have them do the troubleshooting. But I think a lot of times in production, the things that your end users are seeing are probably things that just your regular users are seeing. So if you have like the regular user that can log in and go through the user journey, then you'll be able to debug.
Question.
I have a final one. I keep saying that I have a final one, Kristin. Thank you so much for being patient here. So, the environment that I work in is heavily regulated because it's healthcare, and in production, majority of the data is secured by PHI and PII data.
Yep.
Of the major struggles that we have is mirroring the data in the lower environments, especially because we need to brush the data clean and ensure that no PII is being copied down to the lower environments. How would you approach this scenario if you have worked in a very similar environment?
Yeah, I have worked in a very similar environment. And so what we've done is there's a whole masking process that happens a few times a year where what happens is they pull down the environment or they pull down all the data from production, and then all of the data goes through a series of maskings. So social security numbers, first and last names, addresses, everything goes through and it gets masked. And then everything in the test account gets, or the QA environment that gets replaced with those values. And then that's sort of like a double-edged sword, because for teams that need to have like new refreshed data, that's really useful for them. But for teams that have maybe set up in their QA environment, they've set up like some really complicated scenarios. Sometimes doing that refresh will like destroy all of their really complicated scenarios. So, you have to kind of find a middle ground. Like you could have maybe one test environment that's refreshed in that way with the masked users, and another test environment that doesn't get refreshed but has all just fake stuff in it. That would be one way to do it. Another way to do it would be to have your refresh happen less frequently, so it's not blowing away configurations that people have. Or, I mean, this would be more complicated, but if it was possible to say, let's ignore all of the users who, whose names start with test or something like that, and we won't refresh that data. That'd be another way to do it. But it requires a lot of cooperation from people who know how to grab data from databases and mask it, which is not me. All right, there was a question from the room, and then I'll take the next question from the chat.
Thank you. I have a follow-up question regarding testing in production environment. So what if it's e-commerce application and you have to use real credit cards? Is there a way to simulate that kind of behavior?
There is. I've only done it one time, and this was years and years ago. I worked for a company that had a mobile app, and there was like I can't remember if it was just a pro version or if everybody had to pay to get the app. I don't remember, but one of the things that I needed to do as part of the testing was simulate like actually paying for the app. And we had dummy credit cards that were used that would be recognized by the credit card system as a dummy credit card. So that it wasn't going to charge anybody, but it still allowed you to go through the test. And then in recent years, I've worked with a environment or a feature where I needed to be able to put in a checking account number. And I found the same thing. I just like actually did a little search, and I discovered that a bank, I think maybe it's Chase Bank, has some fake checking account numbers that you can use for that. And so then, you put in the fake number, and your application recognizes, oh, this counts as a valid checking account, but it's not actually real.
Thank you.
Yeah. Okay, I'll do the one from the chat now. Is it a good idea to have the developers manually delete test data from production after testing is completed so that the real clients don't see it? Personally, I feel like it's a good idea in production to not even create the new test data. Like what I like to do, for example, when I'm doing API tests in production is I only do gets. I don't do any puts. I don't do any posts so that no new data is being created. I think if you felt that you needed to have, let's say, automated testing that was created in production, I would definitely make sure that you had cleanup steps to clean it out. So I think, like, I guess my answer is twofold. One is I would try not to create new test data in the first place in production, beyond what was already in there and was kind of recognized as test data that always stays there. But if for some reason for your scenarios you have to create the data, I would definitely delete it.
You can go ahead. So my question is not related to testing. Just curious, like, if you ever ran into a scenario where you were proposing test strategy for these complicated projects, did the stakeholders ask for ROI? Like you want to introduce a new tool, a new management, or a few more people. Like, how did you handle that?
Yeah, that mostly has not been my job. It's maybe been the manager that I work with's job. But it's been my experience when I'm trying to convince anyone of anything is to use data, whatever data I have. So if I'm trying to say, like, let's use an example of we need a test case management system, and the test case management system is going to cost us $50,000 a year, and management saying, whoa, we don't want to spend $50,000 a year. I would create a spreadsheet that would show the amount of time that I am taking to make regression test plans every time the other testers on my team need to run regression. So, and then compound that through the life of the project, just do the math and say, in the sum total of this complicated project, I am going to spend 16 hours doing this. Whereas, using this tool, and maybe I've got like a free version of the tool so I can demonstrate, what takes me ordinarily, 20 minutes to set up, I can do in 30 seconds. And then show them what that time savings is. I think managers and people who are in charge of budgets generally think in terms of, like you said, that ROI. So you need to demonstrate to them, this will be a good return on your investment. Having another tester will mean that we can release this feature sooner, which means that we will have more customers, which will be a good return on your investment.
I have a question regarding UAT. What would be the best time frame for UAT, let's say for mid-size application? And since we are in consulting, what would be the best approach to let the client know that we need that kind of testing for this application?
So when you're talking about UAT, are you talking about like end users for whom you created an application? Well, I mean, I think, and this is not an area that I've had any experience with, but I would say, the best time would be when it's ready. When you feel like, there might still be some open bugs, but the open bugs might be like edge cases. But if you've got the general functionality there and it is working, the common user journeys are working from end to end, I would say that would be the time. And then allow them to provide the feedback, say, this is exactly what we're looking for, or wait, no, this thing isn't quite right. But I think probably the sooner that you can get that kind of feedback, the better, so that you don't have to, go back and scrap everything you've done.
Thank you. Any more questions from the room or from the participants? I think we are done from the room.
All
Kristin.
right. Well, you all asked such great questions. This has been really, really fun.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, sure thing.
Yeah, and feel free to join our groups. Follow us on LinkedIn page and meetup groups, and please follow Kristin as well. We're going to send some emails out with our information, and it'll all be in there. Thank you so much.
Oh,
Thank you,
that'd be
Kristin,
great.
again.
All right, thanks. Thank you. Have a good night, everybody. Bye.
Thank you so much.